Your manor provides the annual £20 required to hold the title and the local authority that comes with it. You govern the village, you lead the hunt, and you answer to no man but the king. The Royal Audit of 1297 defines the value of your primary equipment at £100, effectively tethering your autonomy to the whim of a crown-appointed clerk. Same ancestral manor, same feudal seal, but your ability to walk away has vanished. You are a high-stakes military asset whose fiscal health is measured against the crushing cost of maintaining a warhorse and professional armor. Every penny your land yields is already spoken for by the requirements of your gear and your retinue. You assumed your wealth granted you agency, but you are discovering that your status, like those of your peers meeting the standard income threshold, is a heavily regulated professional obligation. The Crown has turned this romantic ideal of independent lordship into a managed franchise. You are not an autonomous warrior. You are a line item in a royal ledger. The Crown treats your estate as a tactical asset, not your family home. You monitor local harvests and peasant labor to hit a fiscal quota. Every coin your land produces is earmarked for armor, war horses, and the administrative tax of scutage. When the king demands a muster, you do not choose your terms. You respond to a state-mandated draft that treats your property as a franchise license. If your yields fall, the royal clerk views the deficit as a breach of contract rather than a hardship. You serve at the pleasure of a sovereign, who views your land tenure as a revocable delivery system for infantry and cavalry. Your status is a rigid, top-down obligation that forces you to sink your capital into volatile assets. Now that you see the fragility of your position, the danger becomes clear. The state can redefine your liability overnight, and you lack the leverage to object. The Crown does not merely track your service, it monitors your inventory. If your Destrier perishes in the field, royal wardrobe clerks reference that £100 valuation to decide if you receive a full restaro equorum. This policy acts as a rigid, state-controlled insurance scheme. You are not a free agent. You are a contractor waiting to see if your primary asset qualifies for a payout. This reality transforms your standing once the audit records are filed and the fiscal cycle begins anew. The audit records finalize your status as a dual-natured fiscal entity. First, you are the landed vassal. Your soil is a delivery system for royal quotas, and your local prestige acts as secondary collateral for the state's demand. You manage village harvests and local disputes, yet you do not own the revenue. You merely administer the Crown's tactical asset. Then, the campaign begins. The transition is absolute. You shed the role of administrator to become a household knight, tethered exclusively to the royal wardrobe accounts. Your income shifts to a fixed rate meant to offset the cost of your presence on the field. You trade the volatile, weather-dependent yield of your manor for the cold, regimented cash of a state operative. This is not a single career path, but two distinct economic tracks. You might spend years as a quiet landed operator, only to be drafted into a campaign where your agricultural uncertainty is replaced by the rigid, flat wage of a royal servant. Many landholders recognized this volatility early. They chose to pay scutage rather than be officially branded as knights, shielding their estates from the Crown's direct oversight. Once the state codified you as a professional asset, the distinction between your personal solvency and the king's tactical budget effectively dissolved. It is a probability game where your primary objective is avoiding total liquidation before the next audit cycle. You are either paying for the privilege of your own service or drawing a survival wage from the royal purse. Rarely do those states coexist. This bifurcation defines the limit of your power. You have the title, but the state holds the ledger. You must reconcile these competing lives. When you look at the raw cost of the armor and mounts required just to step onto the field, that initial, non-recoupable capital outlay for your panoply is where the fantasy of your status finally breaks against the wall of simple arithmetic. Now that you know the real numbers behind your professional standing, the next phase, the entry costs for this service, is far more unforgiving, and almost nobody sees the scale of that burden coming. To even step onto the field, you must be a man of property. If your land generates less than £20 a year, the math simply fails to support the hardware you are legally required to carry. Your life is not your own, but your equipment is yours alone to purchase. You are looking at a full suite of plate, mail, and weaponry that can easily run you £50 of silver. Consider that for a moment. You have effectively locked away 2.5 years of your entire estate's annual revenue into cold iron and chain. This is a massive, liquid-to-static capital conversion that leaves you with nothing in reserve. Then there is the Destrier. You need a warhorse capable of sustaining the impact of a charge, a specialized animal that functions as your most vital tactical asset. In the light of the 1300 royal records, these animals are priced at 20, 50, perhaps even £100. If you buy at the top of that range, you have sunk 5 years of your total land income into a single beast that is, by definition, a primary target for every enemy archer on the field. You think this is a status symbol? It is a gamble where the house holds every card. Beyond the plate and the horse, you must outfit your retinue. Your prestige mandates that you arrive with men, horses, and wagons to manage your supply lines. These men do not fight for free, and they do not feed themselves on air. Your land revenue is now being cannibalized by the wages of your own attendants before you have even drawn a sword in the king's service. You are essentially paying the state for the privilege of being the one who gets to take the risk. Look at the ledger again. Every pound you spend on your kit is a pound you cannot spend on managing your fields. If the harvest fails, you cannot sell your armor to buy seed. The law mandates you keep it in good repair, or you face the consequences of the distraint. Your facets are permanently locked into a state-managed requirement. You are maintaining a delivery system for someone else's political goals, and the entry fee is your entire net worth. The question of why two knights with the same land return such different results isn't found in the fields, but in the gamble of their equipment. One stays home to pay the tax, the other rides into the slaughterhouse of attrition. We examine next how the crown turns that risk into a permanent state of indebtedness. The ledger was not a record of your assets, but a tally of your liabilities to the crown. Once you fell under the scope of the 1278 distraint of knighthood, your land was no longer a private refuge. It was a tactical asset, repurposed by the state to feed a military quota you had no power to refuse. Because this status was a mandate rather than a choice, you were often forced to leverage your income against the very threat of its own exhaustion. You could be a landowner in name, yet possess no true equity when your primary obligation, your service, could be voided or reclaimed by royal whim. Consider the mechanics of your survival. If your patrons standing at court faltered, the institutional protection, holding your estate together, vanished. You were left holding the cost of your armor and mounts, which were essentially sunk capital, while your revenue stream, the harvest of your manor, might be diverted by royal requisition or stripped by scutage fines. You were forced to borrow against a future that was increasingly tied to the political stability of your superiors. You had to finance the equipment that the law forced you to own, even when your land yielded nothing but debt. This was a structural trap where the necessity of maintaining your status cannibalized your own capital. Your status was an expensive coat of paint on a crumbling foundation. Why is it that two knights, both burdened by the same requirements and land yields, emerge from the royal audit with such contrasting fortunes? The answer lies in this hidden friction. a reliance on secondary credit markets that existed only as long as you were perceived to be a rising star in the king's retinue. The moment your credit evaporated, your land was no longer yours. It was a holding pen for the crown's next creditor. Now that you see how your wealth was effectively tethered to a system of state-enforced debt, the true nature of the daily wage you received on campaign becomes a different kind of problem entirely. The math we look at next is far worse, and almost nobody sees the scale of that gamble until the money is already gone. When you contrast your 24 pence daily royal pay against the 2 pence earned by an infantry archer, the 12-fold gap looks like a fortune. In the wardrobe rolls of the year 1300, that pay rate is often interpreted as a mark of your status as a professional elite. But once you align that daily sum with the cost of your primary operational asset, the logic shifts. You are not receiving a salary. You are receiving a structured recovery fund designed to offset the rapid attrition of your most expensive tactical requirements. You have capitalized your primary warhorse at a valuation ranging from 20 to 100 pounds. That figure reshapes your behavior the moment the campaign begins. A mounted knight who loses his Destrier does not merely surrender a tactical advantage. He forfeits the physical embodiment of 5 years of his estate's yield. The result is a fighter who weighs every charge with the caution of an investor, watching a volatile asset. Your daily 2 shillings cannot bridge the gap between one catastrophic loss and the long recovery that follows. You hold your ground when the strategy demands you push forward, because the personal financial ruin of a fallen mount is yours alone to bear. The crown thus fields a cavalry arm structurally incentivized to preserve itself above all else. This disparity in compensation actively shapes the composition of the royal army. When the crown sets a knight's rate at 12 times that of an archer, it signals a deliberate weighting of resources toward a small, expensive cavalry arm over expendable infantry. An archer can be replaced in a season. A fully equipped knight cannot. The force structure tilts toward fewer, costlier combatants who absorb resources far out of proportion to their numbers. A single engagement that claims 5 knights costs the treasury more than raising an entire company of bowmen, which means the army's tactical flexibility is constrained by the very economics that built it. This is not a client-contractor relationship. It is a closed system of dependency. The crown offers scutage as an alternative to personal service, yet that alternative is engineered to deepen the trap rather than offer escape. A knight who pays the fee to stay home preserves his equipment but forfeits any compensating income from the royal wardrobe. He saves his horse from battlefield destruction but watches his reserves erode without a counterbalancing wage. Meanwhile, the knight who answers the call accepts a daily rate that never covers the replacement cost of what he risks. Every option in the ledger is calibrated to extract value from the landholder. Whether he serves in the field or pays to remain at home, there is no position in this system where the arithmetic favors the man who holds the title. Your entire position ultimately hinges on the interpretation of a single royal clerk. The audit of your estate's output, the valuation of your equipment, and the assessment of your readinesses are all filtered through an administrator, whose judgment is final and largely unchallengeable. A clerk who downgrades your Destrier's valuation on paper can eliminate your eligibility for full compensation when it falls in the field. A notation of deferred maintenance on your harness can trigger the distraint of knighthood before you have a chance to explain the shortfall. The system places extraordinary power in the hands of bureaucratic intermediaries whose loyalty is to the crown's fiscal targets, not to your survival. You are one audit away from ruin, and the person holding the pen has no incentive to be generous. The exhaustion of your primary military capital forces you to borrow against your own lands to stay in the field. The micromath of how your maintenance costs systematically cannibalize that daily wage creates an impossible fiscal trap. Now that you understand why that 24 pence pay is really just a repair fund, the next step is to examine how the fixed costs of your retinue and armor turn your very survival into a liability. Consider the life of a single Destrier valued at 100 pounds. The burden of that asset reveals something larger than a simple financial mismatch. The entire framework, the income threshold, the equipment mandate, the below-market wage, was not assembled by accident. Each element was set by royal authority. The Crown defined the income requirement, specified the equipment standard, and fixed a daily rate at 2 shillings that it knew could never cover the replacement cycle. When you look at the architecture of these rules together, the system appears designed to keep the knightly class in a state of permanent manageable debt. The Destrier is not merely an expensive liability, it is the linchpin of a political strategy that ensures no landholder ever grows independent enough to challenge the Crown's authority. The ledger does not account for the hidden friction of your daily existence, and this is where the arithmetic turns predatory. While the archer beside you survives on 2 pence, his requirements are minimal. Your overhead is a different matter, including the continuous maintenance of squires, grooms, and the ongoing labor of smiths to clean steel that pits and rusts the moment it meets damp air. These are not variable costs that you can slash when the harvest fails. They are rigid institutional requirements mandated by the royal wardrobe clerks, and they must be met regardless of whether you are actively on campaign or sitting in your manor. Think of your status as a franchise where the license fee is the constant threat of distraint, and your operating budget is a fixed drain. If you earn 20 pounds a year from your lands, that is your total gross, before you even begin to function as a knight. From that figure, you must carve out the acquisition of your armor, which can reach 50 pounds, and the feed and stabling for multiple mounts. By the time you account for the scuddage fees and the sheer cost of sustaining the retinue your rank demands, your net position is rarely in the positive. The daily royal wage arrives only when you are in the field, which is precisely when your financial risk reaches its absolute zenith. You are effectively running a military delivery system, where the recovery fund is rarely sufficient to replace a dead Destrier, let alone clear your standing debts. This is not an accident of the economy. It is the core mechanism of the system. It is a high-stakes probability game where the house holds every card. If you are a knight whose land returns exactly the minimum 20 pounds, one bad crop cycle or one lost charger leaves you in a deficit that takes years to claw back. You are not an owner of capital in any meaningful sense. You are the involuntary manager of an institutional liability. Your wealth is entirely dependent on keeping your heavy gear out of the mud and your horses out of the ground, long enough to satisfy the demands of your tenure. Yet, as you stare at your empty ledger, a glaring contradiction emerges. You watch some peers wither, while others somehow thrive despite the same crushing levies. The reality of your estate depends far less on your own management than it does on the hidden, shifting volatility of the administrative system itself. That is a layer of the trap almost no one notices until their title has already been forfeited to the exchequer. You stare at the parchment records and the names begin to blur. A landholder appears in the royal archives under a specific knightly quota, his identity tied to a patch of soil and a service expectation. A decade later, he is gone. The land remains, the quota remains, but the man is replaced. In the cold, unyielding ink of the exchequer, these shifts are rarely explained. There is no column for personal bankruptcy, or the crushing pressure of a mounting debt load that eventually forces a quiet sale or a permanent transfer to the Crown. The records are designed to track the asset, not the person who held the title. When you cross-reference the names documented in the 1166 Carte Baronum against the later royal wardrobe rolls, you find a recurring pattern of attrition that the formal language of feudalism tries to hide. It is easy to assume that a shift in tenure is simply a matter of standard inheritance or a peaceful transition between families. But the reality is often found in the margin of the ledger, where maintenance costs collided with the strict £20 income threshold for compulsory service. When the overhead of armor upkeep and warhorse maintenance drained the resources of a small estate, the knight was left with nothing but the title and a deepening liability. There is a mechanical brutality to this system. Because the state mandated your equipment and your availability, you were forced to extract every possible penny from your tenants to meet the Crown's audit standards. If a bad harvest or a local crisis struck, you could not simply pause your military obligations. The state expected its quota of service, or the corresponding scutage payment regardless of your actual current balance. This is why you see estates churning through different holders at such a rapid rate. It was a perpetual cycle of capital depletion, where the only way to avoid the administrative trap was to be wealthy enough to survive the losses or unlucky enough to lose the land entirely. The ambiguity of these transitions serves the system perfectly. By masking whether a property changed hands due to foreclosure, death, or forfeiture, the records preserve the illusion of a stable, permanent hierarchy. Yet if you track the actual solvency of these individual units, you realize the stability was an administrative fiction. The land was not a legacy you owned. It was a tactical, state-managed resource that you merely occupied until the next audit proved you were no longer capable of funding your own position. You are left with the chilling question of who really held the power when the knight himself was so easily removed from the books. The question of why some families managed to persist while others vanished in a single generation forces us to look even closer at the daily struggle of the ledger. The model we examine next is far more volatile than the simple survival threshold, and it is a reality almost nobody sees coming. Two landholders appear in the 1166 rolls, each earning £20 annually. On paper, they are identical. Yet their ledgers tell a different story. The first man treats knighthood as a cost. He buys the minimum kit allowed by royal standard, spending £15 on a functional suit of plate. When summoned for a campaign, he pays the 40-shilling scutage fee. His £20 income is preserved by staying home. He keeps his harvest, his laborers, and his land's productivity intact. His net position is reduced by that single payment, but his core asset remains untouched by the attrition of war. He operates within the system's cheapest option. The second man sees the same £20 income as venture capital. He pours £50 into a top-tier harness and £100 into a Destrier of the highest grade, hoping royal favor and ransom opportunities will outstrip the cost. He answers the call, earning his 2-shilling daily wage. In the third week, his £100 horse dies under a Scottish lance. His daily wage of 24 pence is framed as a reimbursement. It is not profit. It is an insurance premium against a catastrophic loss. One day's nightly wage is less than 1/100th of the horse's value. He cannot recover the deficit from his land's annual yield. To re-equip and maintain his status, he must borrow against future harvests, placing the very grant that defines his station as collateral. The first man's holding persists through generations. The second man's name vanishes from the rolls. His land forfeit or absorbed by debt. The gap between them is not one of income, but of capital allocation against a fixed predatory set of obligations. The royal records catalog these divergent outcomes across the realm, yet they are silent on the choices that drove them. They log the silver paid and the horses lost, but not the intent. This inconsistency raises a sharper problem. If ruin could strike from a single bad deployment, what happened when the crown decided the land was worth more seized than granted? The system we examine next turned the knight from an asset into an obstacle. The illusion of the independent landholder dissolves the moment you audit the transition from feudal obligation to the cold arithmetic of the 2-shilling daily wage. You are a tactical unit whose entire economic lifespan is defined by how long your equipment and your Destrier can survive a campaign. When the king pays your 24 pence per day, he is not rewarding your valor. He is paying for the depreciation of state-mandated assets you are contractually obligated to replace. The system is designed to consume the capital it requires you to hold, ensuring that the only way to remain a knight is to continually cycle your wealth back into the service of the treasury. This is a closed loop of professional servitude, where the title is merely a license to exhaust your estate for the sake of the crown. With the true cost of this contract clear, the next question is what happens when the institution itself pivots, and whether the nobility survives the shift from military contractors to a court that no longer needs them to carry a sword.